Palladas has always been a controversial figure. His dating, historical context, and religious commitments have been challenged and re-established time and again. Since the groundbreaking publications by Cecil Bauer and Avril Cameron in the 1960s, the scholarly consensus placed his flower rate in the second part of the 4th century, his suggested dates being 319, 390, or 400, and saw him undoubtedly as a pagan writer with anti-Christian stance in many of his epigrams, however indirectly expressed. While the second part of the picture is still there, placing Palladas in the later 4th century and making him witness to the militant Christian legislation under Theodosius I has been recently challenged by Kevin Wilkinson. By reinterpreting some key texts by Palladas, which had previously been used to secure his position as a contemporary of the infamous enforcement of anti-pagan legislation in Alexandria in 391, as well as by pointing out the early papirical anthology, which includes 35 epigrams by Palladas, Wilkinson contends that a much more plausible solution would be to see Palladas as someone active in the late 3rd and early 4th century. In this perspective, Palladas becomes witness to and source on the ecclesiastical policy of Constantine I. While this interpretation can have its problems, which are not to be discussed here, I embrace it as a general chronological framework, and in my discussion I will try to see Palladas in the literary context of the early 4th century as much as possible. Discourse, another key term in the title of my paper, and more specifically the Christian discourse, is another contended and entangled notion. However, I will deliberately try to keep the methodological things simple and will refer to just Christian discourse as a more or less stable set of ideas put into more or less stable phraseology in the text expressly professing their Christian commitments. In my paper, I will provide several brief case studies of Christian phraseology as used in the works of Palladas. I contend that there is a coherent, deliberate, and highly critical attitude to Christianity in his epigrams, which is put across by the subtle but pointed way in which he introduces the elements of contemporary Christian discourse in his writings. Besides, I will try to show that this process of systematically making reference to the Christian discourse was underway in the inscriptional epigrams as well. Their authors seem to have had a wide range of perspectives on the new imperial religion. As mentioned above, the dislike to Christianity is not something Palladas tries to keep down. For instance, in his well-known epigram number 384 in the 11th book of the Greek Ontology, he mocks monks, showing that their sheer number defies the idea of being a monk. He asks, why are you so many if you're monks, if you want to be munoi? However, there are much more nuanced kinds of polemics in Palladas, which go well along the line of the general allusiveness of his diction. Let's look at the 10th epigram of, epigram 45 in the 10th book of Anthology. That's handout 1. In it, Palladas discusses 3 perspectives on human nature. First one is Platonic, where human is a heavenly plant. Second one goes without a clear token, while it is characterized as something which would be fantasized for the sake of being religiously even more reverent. Houtos ei pantiscos mon plasmeti semnotero. Obviously, even more reverent than Platonists are. The key point of this second view is nevertheless in stating that man originated from clay. In the last lines, the harsh truth is revealed. The stark fact of human origin from a dirty drop produced out of lust is offered as the ultimate answer. The idea of creating a man from clay, which is the essence of the second reverent option, is not absent from Hellenic tradition. After all, this is what Prometheus is credited with doing, a tradition going from Hesiod and servicing across centuries. However, there seems to be nothing about the mythic story to deserve to be called a more reverent idea than that held by the Platonists. A good illustration is in The Birds by Aristophanes, where human origin from a dirty substance is a natural element of a highly satirical Psogos-like text. That's your handout too. Come on, man! By their nature, people live in darkness. They are, but like another generation of leaves, of little might, production of clay, feeble leaves as they are, resembling shadows. Anyway, this understanding doesn't qualify for semnoteron. Christian teaching seemed to be a natural option here. It would provide the idea of creation from clay and would account for the reverent attitude to the idea, as mentioned at the Epigram. More than that, the early Christian apologists made rather much of this point in their polemic with the Hellenists and underscored the fact that pagans must be well aware of the conception themselves. For instance, Clement of Alexandria, in his Stromata, writing on the dawn of the 3rd century, brings up creation from clay with reference to otherwise unknown verses by Callimachus. That's your handout 3. The motive is also used by Eusebius in a very similar polemical perspective in his Evangelical Preparation, written in the early 4th century, when discussing creation of man. This was as well to show that the pagan wisdom is actually prefigured in the Old Testament, and consequently elements of Christian teaching are to be found in the writings of pagans. That's your handout 4, which reads, Callimachus explicitly states that if Prometheus created you originated from nothing else but clay. Please mark this striking similarity in phrasing to what Palladas says, ek pelu gegunas. All this discourse on creation from clay by the early Christian apologists should indicate that the idea must have been actively discussed in the context of pagan Christian polemic, which makes it a very likely context for the epigram. Palladas seems to have united two, as it were, far-fetched metaphysical semnae philosophiae, Platonic and Christian, and to have brought it into dramatic contrast with his own highly down-to-earth and deliberately cynical position. While Palladas' ardent anti-Christian stance has been well acknowledged, and this is just another stroke to be added to the existing picture, other and subtler uses of Christian discourse are to be seen in Palladas' writing too. Take, for instance, his ethics on Tuhe, for which he has much bitter words than for Christians. After all, he doesn't call them harlots, at least, which he does to Tuhe. In the handout 5, he laments what is usually interpreted as either transformation of Tuhe's temple into a pub or introduction of her statue into a tavern. Tuhe, who treats life as a tavern keeper or plays tricks to it, translated this way, she has a charactus fusis. This time around becomes a tavern keeper herself, mixing together and pouring around drinks. In line 2, Tuhe is said to have asun charactus fusis, which is not so easy to translate. Literally, this means unblended, unmixed nature. But this rare word was typically used to mean stubborn and discordant. That is, not easily rendering itself to mixing with other entities. However, the combination of a word meaning unmixed with the word fusis seems to have an unmistakably Christian ring to it. In the context of the emerging Christological clashes of the early 4th century concerning the twofold human and divine nature of Christ, phrases like asyncetos fusis or akratos fusis were commonplace and recurrent in Christian discourse. Thus, early in the 4th century, Bishop of Emesa, Nemesius, addressed the Christological issues in the very terms to be later taken on during the so-called Arian controversy, which again peaked during Constantine's I reign. In the treatise on the nature of man, Nemesius wrote discussing the relation between soul and body in handout 6. It is to be examined how the unity of soul and soulless body is exercised. How is it that that both when body is united with soul, it still remains body, and how the soul, having existence of its own, retains its nature unmixed and unspoiled? These terms were used also by Athanasius of Alexandria to challenge Arian, so-called Arian Christology around 340s. It's your handout 7. For it was in no other way that he, Christ, bore his nature as unmixed, and at the same time as that of the Father, but by the way of condescending in a fatherly and man-loving way when he accepted all these, that is, human features, and introduced them into his nature. A little bit later in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa would speak in these terms, building his own Christology too. That's handout 8. As we see, the discourse on divinity's unmixed nature permeates the early Christian theological discourse. But this is exactly what Palladas refers to in his epigram on Tuhe. He speaks of a divinity he speaks of a divinity applying to her the formula unmixed nature. Naturally enough, similar expressions were used by late antique pagan philosophers and scholars, and words Asynthetos and Akratos constituted part of scholarly late antique discourse at large. However, they can be shown to be systematically used to speak of natural phenomena, more specifically speech and sound and music sounds, as you can see in handout 9 and handout 10. Nowhere, apart from the early Christian theological discourse, contemporary to Palladas, is it applied to speak of divinities, while quest for gods and their nature was notoriously great in the late antique pagan philosophy. I contend that Palladas in this epigram is making a typical pun of his by combining the meaning discordant with a reference to the Christian use of the phrase unmixed nature, while the latter is typically associated with theological vocabulary. This phraseology, with reference to divinity, is not attested in pagan sources, but is standard in Christian Christological discourse of the early 4th century. This kind of wordplay, when a word is used in varying senses in the same text, is well attested in Palladas style, which makes it a typical thing for him to do. As we have seen in these two brief case studies of Christian phraseology in Palladas' epigrams, along with more subtle ways of criticism of Christianity, Palladas can put elements of early Christian discourse to different kinds of uses. He seems to have quite a pattern of introducing Christian allusions when speaking of deities which are either personally disliked by him, as is Tuhe, or which are satirically pictured, like Hades. In the epigram I can't discuss here. See, however, your handout 11 about Iatros Sophistes, Magnus going down to Hades. Christian discourse seems to have given to have made its way into the text to be either attacked or wielded as a rhetorical weapon to attack. In either way, its function is strongly linked with the rhetoric of satire. Now, there are striking similarities to these interplay going on in the late antique inscriptional epigrams, as I hope to show in two brief case studies. As you may remember, the first epigram by Palladas I discussed addressed philosophical schools and, as I contended, expressed a negative opinion of Christianity and Platonism. An inscriptional epitaph from Smyrna, dated to the 2nd century AD, is rather philosophical and tries to be instructive too. That's your handout 12. Structurally, its precepts bear tantalizing resemblance to the epigram by Palladas. There are two perspectives on life which are declared wrong. Don't live either as if you have eternity to live, or as if you are going to die early, akumeros. There is no positive option, however, it is negatively implied. Do not live so that others could whip you with words because of your being insolvent in advanced years. This is again like in Palladas, a rather cynical though practical idea to follow, which is given as the right way to live. I would like to draw your attention to the formula Ros eis aones echon zen. I suggest that this is an elusive way to speak about Christian idea, if not of life, then of death rather. The phrase as Ionas itself is unparalleled in pagan literary texts. The singular form as Iona is there in very limited contexts. It is occasionally used by Plutarch, for instance, that's your handout 13. The phrase has slightly better evidence in Hellenistic inscriptions. See, for instance, a decree for certain Callimachos, strategos of the Perithybas, which dates to 39 BC, that's your handout 14. We can also refer to the acclamation to 3 Gordians in Perga, which is securely dated to 80 to 83 AD, that's your handout 15. Both these texts have a clear official and dedicatory ring to them, and the phrase Eisiona is used here to underpin the grandeur of the glory of persons of great consequence. Apart from lack of direct parallelism with the wording of the philosophical epitaph I discuss, Ionas singular, not plural, The dedicatory formula eis Iona bears very different associations, having nothing to do with private precepts given at the face of death. Unlike the very few and substantially irrelevant pagan contextualization, the early Christian parallels are many and significant. The origin of the formula is admittedly the doxological formula "To him be glory to the day of eternity," recurrent in the New Testament corpus. The references are presented in handout 16. Even in the New Testament, the formula has a clear liminal perspective dealing with afterlife and eternity, or even apocalyptics. This aspect is further brought out in the early Christian writings. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, says in his commentary on the book of Revelation with reference to Christ, that's handout 17, "He, Christ, being born as a mortal, put a limit to his earthly life, so that he sits on the right-hand side of the glory up on high, and so that he can live for eternity when the death when the death does not reign anymore. For that reason, the one who lives an eternity with God, not dying anymore." A very similar stance toward afterlife, which is seen as eternal life, to eis Ionas den, is to be found in the commentary on Psalms by Apollinaris of Laodicea, a near contemporary of Palladas as well. He claims, that's your handout 18, this text refers to Apollinaris because it is preserved in later testimonia. So Apollinaris is saying that even more important things in his research about men are there. He, Apollinaris, disparagingly says that the life that we live is nothing, while our birth was not in vain, which, says he, means that the decay will not stay with us once the kingdom is secured, and that at that moment both the decay will be gone and eternal life will be granted. We can see a coherent early Christian discourse on a believer's afterlife expressed in terms of the formula "To eis Ionas den." I find it highly likely that the 2nd century inscriptional epitaph must have alluded to this kind of religious ideas expressed in the perfectly matching wording. Furthermore, it challenges the perception very much like Palladas does, contrasting the metaphysical belief with rough facts of life, the fear of ugly and disrespected old age being the only moral principle. This surprisingly close inscriptional match to Palladas' text, highly skeptical of Christian teaching, is not, however, the only perspective to be found in inscribed epigrams. Leaving behind the early epitaph, we can look at a later dedicatory inscription. In handout 19, you see a honorific inscription for certain Ampelios, dated to the 4th century AD. On the face of it, you could say it was commissioned by an athlete, or even for an athlete, because it mentions exercises in leaping, skirtao. As Louis Robert established, however, Ambelius was a proconsul of Achaia residing in Aegina. Looking at the text from the normal Hellenic linguistic perspective, you can hardly make sense of the second line of the whole thing. But once you give it a Christian backdrop, it all adds up. While total and paralleled in Hellenic tradition, the meaning "to rejoice in something" is standard for skirtao plus the noun in accusative since the early Christian times on. Moreover, the meaning is typically found in the phrase finding parallels in the epigram for Ampelios. The epigram says "Pericalia erga Ampelio skirto caterpomai," the pairing of skirto with another verb, resulting in a phrase with an overall meaning "to rejoice," is perfectly matched by skirtao and skirtao kai galiao or ephraino in the early Christian texts. Thus, Origen in the 3rd century says in his address to the martyrs, that's your handout 20, "May you be happy and rejoice, keeping in mind the great reward lying in heaven for those who were persecuted and mocked at for the sake of their virtue and for the sake of the Son of the God." In the copies of letters of John Chrysostom, 4th century, the expression is all around. See, for instance, his letter to Paisanius, where the formula seems to be a standard convention of early Christian epistolography already. That's your handout 21. These are just a few examples of the phrase skirtao kaiterpomai used syntactically with direct object, which entered the stock of Christian festive rhetoric and was later perused by the Byzantines. But this is exactly the formula from the 4th century dedicatory inscription, which otherwise reveals no sign of being Christian. In its other parts, it alludes to the cult of Muses, for instance, and nowhere to Christ. I believe that we have here every reason to believe that a popular element of Christian discourse made its way into the declamatory rhetoric of the honorific epigram, however unwittingly. It bears no negative connotation here and is put to use beyond the framework of pagan versus Christian polemic, either political, philosophical, or aesthetical. But the text becomes intelligible only when you read it with the Christian formula in mind. I think this is the good moment to ask probably the most fundamental question. Just how much deliberate and intentional were the references to Christian discourse in the epigrams I have discussed, as well as in many others? I would suggest that when we can see self-conscious polemic, however subtly expressed, as in the philosophical epigram by Palladas of the 2nd century epitaph, there is a designed attempt to introduce an allusion to a Christian idea put in a popular catchphrase. However, in cases like in the Ambellius epigram, it doesn't have to be so. Probably here, a little bit of theoretical sophistication can come in handy. According to Michel Foucault, discourse is exactly the language entangled with preconceived ideas which you use no matter how personally conscious you are of these ideas. I believe this was exactly the process underway in the late antiquity from 2nd century on. As Christianity was gaining momentum first as one of the many exotic cults and eventually as a state religion, its language started to permeate the Hellenic world. In this perspective, when Palladas spoke of Synkertos Physios of Tyche, he need not have been fully aware of the Christological implications of the phrase. If he was, it was an act of conscious acknowledgement of cultural significance of his rival. And if he was not, it means only one thing, that Christian metrics already had him, and that there was no any versus thing anymore. Thank you.